got a whale of a tale to tell you, lads, a whale of a tale or two.
In 1954, Walt Disney's Buena Vista Distribution released 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. The science fiction adventure movie had an all-star cast that included Kirk Douglas, James Mason, Paul Lucas, and Peter Lorre, with a cameo by a relatively new Disney artist and Imagineer named Harper Goff. Success on the silver screen inspired later success in the parks and ultimately to the creation of a ride that is both gone and quite irreplaceable. In 1951, Harper Goff, who at the time was a Warner Brothers set designer, was visiting London. He stopped at Bassett Loke Limited to purchase a model train, but was told that the one that he'd picked out was being held for another customer. Goff waited for the mysterious buyer to arrive, and the two railfans struck up a conversation. Walt Disney, too, was in England, visiting the set of his first live-action production, Treasure Island. When Goff revealed to Mr. Disney that he was an artist, Walt said, "When you get back to America, come see me." Walt, being Walt, ended up with both the locomotive and the artist. Goff proved himself with much of the early planning for Disneyland. His designs for Walt's beloved Main Street would have been more than enough to make him a legend. He even worked on Walt's prized backyard railroad, the Carolwood Pacific. Goff, who had already worked on big titles like Warner Brothers' Casablanca, was then given his first major Disney studio project as both art director and production designer for Disney's live-action adaptation of Jules Verne's 1870 novel, 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. Goff's personal copy of the script dates his pre-production involvement to as early as 1952. It's no stretch to say that everything that made it to the screen, even the very idea of what we think Verne's world should look like, originated in Goff's prolific imagination. It was only the fifth live-action movie produced by Disney and their first such American production. The previous four all having been produced in England and to date was also their most expensive. Talent seemed to rain down on the production. In addition to the aforementioned cast and Mr. Goff, the writers, Imagineers, and crew behind the scenes came from perhaps the most talented class Disney had ever produced. It was Goff's design of the submarine Nautilus, with its menacing silhouette and elaborate Victorian interiors, that would ultimately lead to the movie earning an Academy Award for art direction. Goff, however, was unintentionally snubbed by the Academy, as Disney executives had failed to include his name on the award submission. A request to add his name after the submission but before the vote was rejected by the Academy. And only Goff's assistant, John Meehan, and set director Emile Coury received awards. The man who director Richard Fleischer had said designed everything got nothing. A 2004 Variety article stated that the Academy had sent an unmarked Oscar to Mr. Goff by way of an apology, but the Academy denies this. The film won a second award for its special effects team, which was headed up by industry legends Robert A. Matty and Peter Ellenshaw. Matty would go on to design Bruce the Shark for Steven Spielberg's Jaws, while Ellenshaw, already considered one of the best matte artists in the world, would work on films like Mary Poppins, which won him another Oscar, The Black Hole, and Dick Tracy. Richard Fleischer, son of animation pioneer Max Fleischer of Popeye fame, would become legendary in his own right, directing movies as varied as the 1967 musical classic Dr. Dolittle and 1985 sword and sorcery epic Red Sonja. 20,000 Leagues released on December 23, 1954, and became a certified hit, earning $28.2 million against a $5 million budget, staggering $324,025. The film's success earned it a place in the brand-new Disneyland park as a walk-through attraction that was placed in the underutilized Tomorrowland, featuring props and sets from the production.
A whale of a tale, and it's all true, I swear by my tattoo.
Welcome aboard the submarine Nautilus. You will see the Academy Award-winning motion picture sets actually used in filming Walt Disney's 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea.
The attraction was added just a few months after the park opened. It was wildly popular and lasted 11 years, closing in 1966. By the time it closed, an actual submarine ride had already launched. After the 1956 permanent closure of the short-lived Phantom boat rides in Tomorrowland Lagoon, a glass-bottom boat ride was suggested to Walt as a replacement. According to Disneyland Inside Story by Imagineer Randy Bright, Walt said, "No, let's do a real submarine. Let's take them down and give them ports to look out of." By 1957, despite strongly considering 20,000 Leagues as the theme for the new ride, Imagineers and Walt made a strategic decision to base the new submarine ride on real-world naval exploration. Tomorrowland, which Walt was never really happy with, was being completely reimagined. It was the early days of the Cold War. Nuclear technology was the new thing. And a new age of exploration, science, and technology was dawning just below the surface, on land, and in outer space. Jules Verne's fantastic world just wasn't a good fit.
Nearing completion in a shipyard at Groton, Connecticut, is the world's first atomic-powered submarine, the SS Nautilus.
The U.S. Navy had recently launched the world's first nuclear-powered submarine, the only one of her type. The experimental warship and exploratory vessel hull number SSN 571 had been named USS Nautilus in 1951, a year before pre-production began on the Disney film. A happy coincidence, to be sure, as the Navy has a long tradition of naming her ships after sea creatures, with the first use of the name Nautilus dating back to 1803, long predating either the film or the book. Remarkably, both the real Nautilus and her fictional counterpart launched in 1954. Walt, who was personally fascinated by the new atomic fleet, was moved to name each of their submarines after real U.S. subs.
It's the 8th largest submarine fleet in the world. Ranks next to Turkey, I think.
There was a christening ceremony for Disneyland's Nautilus, complete with champagne. It was even attended by officers of the United States Navy and the Vice President Richard Nixon himself. But it wasn't the Nautilus, at least not yet. When it opened in 1959, Submarine Voyage was an immediate hit with both the public and critics. Guests were captivated by the experience of diving underwater aboard real submarines and peering through portholes. Bubbles streamed past the glass to give the impression of diving, upon which detailed underwater scenes were brought to life with lighting effects, animatronic divers, and schools of fish, sunken ruins, and later that year even live mermaids who would wave at the passing submariners. The ride captured the spirit of exploration and innovation that defined New Tomorrowland. The ride vehicles were made to look like smaller versions of the naval submarines the public saw in the evening news or in the pages of popular mechanics. Each one was a sleek vessel capable of seating 38 passengers. But while they gave the illusion of diving deep beneath the waves, the truth was more clever. Each sub was powered by an onboard diesel engine and was only partially submerged, something akin to the original glass-bottom boat concept. Rather than swimming through the water, the vehicles actually drove along steel tracks on the lagoon's floor, which ensured a smooth and controllable ride of about 1,200 feet or about 8 to 10 minutes. The journey concluded with the submarine surfacing and riders returning to the dock, thus completing their voyage through the deep. The ride was a hit and would be duplicated in the new park being planned for Orlando, Florida, but times had changed. The intervening decade would see the advent of manned spaceflight and the lunar landing. The nuclear subs had become old hat, but Imagineers had a solution at hand. Intentionally situated between Fantasyland and Tomorrowland, 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea Submarine Voyage, which was equal parts fantasy and science fiction, would function as the perfect transition and thematic bridge between the two lands. It would take advantage of sci-fi's new respectability and lean into the 1954 movie's dark narrative tone and retro-futuristic Victorian aesthetic, which would later be called steampunk. 12 years after Submarine Voyage, on October 14, 1971, 20,000 Leagues opened at the brand-new Walt Disney World Resort. Delivery of the ride vehicles was running 2 weeks behind and had missed the October 1st grand opening of the park. On the 13th, Imagineer Bob Gurr was sent to manufacture a Tampa boat to retrieve the subs, but there was no time for a grand christening as in California. According to one version of the story, after loading the first boat on the trailer, Gurr found a beer bottle and smashed it across the prow. He's been quoted as saying that the trailer was so overloaded that they pulled into the Magic Kingdom with half the tires flat and the other half on fire. The next morning, the ride was open to guests. Harper Goff was not in attendance. The new ride vehicles were larger, holding up to 40 passengers, and there were 12 of them, compared to Disneyland's 10. They were driven by electric motors rather than the problematic diesel engines that Disneyland didn't phase out until a 1997 refurbishment. The subs were designed by Imagineer George McGinnis, who had worked from both the original Disneyland submarine blueprints and Harper Goff's iconic movie designs. At 1,635 feet, the new ride was longer and more elaborate than its predecessor, but like the Anaheim original, the adventure began with the illusion of a dive. Guests were greeted by the voice of Captain Nemo himself via the talents of Peter Renedy doing an impression of Nemo actor James Mason.
This is Captain Nemo speaking. Welcome aboard the Nautilus. We are proceeding on a course that will take us on a voyage 20,000 leagues under the sea.
Though the submarines never truly submerged, clever use of lighting and a thick curtain of bubbles rising past green patinated brass portholes created a convincing illusion of diving.
But please, remain seated at all times. Here among the reefs,
Guests found themselves gliding through colorful coral reefs filled with Imagineered sea creatures, undulating plant life, and helmeted divers straight from the movie. It was a peaceful beginning, an undersea garden, meant to put the audience at ease. But the ocean is a harsh mistress, and the journey turned darker. The submarines passed through a graveyard of sunken ships with treasure chests scattered across the seafloor. The captain warned of the perils of the deep as the voyage pushed forward.
roam the coastal bottoms in search of food. The giant clam, obviously, is quite safe
Tropical
from
fancy
such marine
gave way to
predators.
frigid danger as the Nautilus ventured beneath the polar ice cap. Jagged ice loomed above, and the attention reached its zenith, just as the submarine escaped being trapped below the
With
ice.
our sonar hydrophones, we have discovered that fish actually talk.
Then came the showstopper, the lost city of Atlantis. Columns lay broken among toppled statues. A rather silly-looking sea serpent moved amongst the ruins, leashed by yet more mermaids, but the peace didn't last. Out of the depths came a giant squid that reached for the Nautilus as Nemo called for electrical charges to drive the creature away. A callback to the dramatic climax of the film. With the escape complete, the Nautilus at last surfaced. Bubbles rose, the lights returned. The narration softened, and guests were returned to the safety of the shore.
Thank you for sailing with us. And now, when the cabin lights come on, please stand by to disembark.
This version of the ride, too, was a great success with guests, but it wasn't without its challenges. The ride system was mechanically and electronically complex, requiring extensive maintenance for both the vehicles and the 10-million-gallon lagoon it occupied. The ride vehicles were cramped, requiring guests to descend steep steps and a narrow passageway, a problem that would only grow with America's waistline. They were poorly ventilated in the Florida heat and humidity, and the portholes were subject to fogging. There were defogging buttons guests could press, but they never really worked well. The ride had a long load and unload sequence, had low throughput, and took up a huge amount of real estate. Additionally, there was no good way to make the vehicles handicapped accessible and no alternative way in which a mobility-impaired guest could enjoy the ride. Sometimes the windows would even leak. The remedy was to stuff the ride operator's seat cushion into the offending porthole. Although slower, nostalgic, heavily immersive, and atmospheric rides like 20,000 Leagues seem to be experiencing a resurgence of popularity in the 2020s. In the 1990s, decreasing ridership, increased operating costs and downtime, and lack of accessibility would doom the ride. 20,000 Leagues closed for refurbishment in 1994, but 2 years later, rather than make the massive investment needed to keep the ride running and relevant, the Nautilus was permanently decommissioned without public fanfare. In 1996, the lagoon became home to Ariel's Grotto, now located in New Fantasyland, a Little Mermaid attraction with character meet and greets and a King Triton fountain. The ride was finally demolished and the lagoon filled in 2004, making room for the park's first major expansion, the aforementioned and equally problematic New Fantasyland, but that, as they say, is another story. My personal memory of 20,000 Leagues was that it was simply the best thing I'd ever done. 7-year-old me walked right into the movie. It was real. I could see the water. I felt myself descend. I sank into the mystery of the darkness. I smelled the ocean, which was probably just tourist sweat, but I definitely heard Nemo play the pipe organ and survive the Kraken's attack. It was real. It was real because it occupied physical space. It had mass. It had unprogrammed motions imparted by the movement of the water. I could have ridden it all day, and in fact I tried to do just that, but Mom and Dad weren't having it. It would be both unfair and inaccurate to say that 20,000 Leagues ultimately failed. To the contrary, it was a great success that had merely run its course creatively and logistically. The fact that the ride's original incarnation lives on as the Finding Nemo submarine voyage attests to its lasting potential, though we must admit that the Anaheim ride is partially preserved both by the thematic flexibility of the vehicles and the great logistical difficulty that removing the attraction would incur due to its unique integration into the land and the impact such an undertaking would have on other attractions, but survive it does. It still attracts crowds every day, more than 60 years later. Captain Nemo sails on in the name of the ride, and Nautilus still parts the waves in Anaheim as hull number 107, still bearing the name. But he isn't our Nemo, and that's not our Nautilus. The loss of 20,000 Leagues represents a turning point in the park's history. A conscious choice was made not to focus the park's investment dollars on a single mythology or a uniquely Disney experience, but to spread the risk among several lesser ideas, known quantities, and safer bets. What replaced it may not be bad in any other context, but it certainly isn't as good. Our Nautilus served faithfully and well, and if anything, we should say that Disney, and perhaps we, failed her. Long may she sail. Fair winds, following seas. If you miss 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea submarine voyage as much as I do, I highly encourage you to watch the VR recreation created by Kevin Perjurer and the DefunctlandVR team. Their work is nothing short of incredible. You can find the link in the video description below. And if you've watched this far and you haven't already, please do me the great kindness of subscribing and clicking the notification icon. And please do like and share this video and comment below. We'd love to hear from you. See you next time.
Ship for sea. Make all preparations for getting underway.
Aye, aye, sir. All hands to station. Angle up on the line. Cast off forward.